Hi, I'm Bill Crystal. Welcome back to Conversations. I'm very pleased to be joined again today by Fred Kagan, director of the Critical Threats Project at the American Enterprise Institute, a historian who actually got his degree on, I think, Soviet and Russian military history, which is quite relevant to our discussion today about Russia and Ukraine. Obviously, Fred's been a major contributor to the public debate for over 25 years on all matters military and military and foreign policy, and works closely with the Institute for the Study of War, which I'm actually proud to be on the board of, on their invaluable daily Ukraine updates, which you should all get, the maps and the detailed account of what's happening on the ground, and also in the information sphere, and an awful lot of good stuff there. And also the Critical Studies Project today, Critical Threats Project. Fred is now putting out a daily Iran update. Is that right?
Yep.
Demonstrations there. We'll have to have. We had a very good Iran discussion with Ray Takei a couple of weeks ago, but maybe we'll have to do an Iran discussion with you. That's not going away either, right? I guess.
No. That's generally pretty good news, I think.
Good. Okay. Well, we need good news. It's tough for the people there, but it's obviously good news. Yeah. And we did a conversation on Russia and Ukraine almost exactly, I think, 6 months ago at the end of April, which I just looked at last night and stands up very well. You were doubtful of Russia's ability to pull itself back together and have a successful offensive. You were very impressed with what Ukraine had done. And I think you sort of thought it would be about where it is now. So where are we? I mean, where are we in the war? How is Ukraine doing? What can they do? What should we be doing? And then we can talk a little much more, I think, somewhat more about Russia and Putin, which I feel like is the underexplored or side of the equation, perhaps, in these days.
Well, thanks for having me back, Bill. It's always good to see you and talk to you. Someone who's also made incredible contributions to the public debate for many, many years.
Fred has to say that.
Yeah.
That was right. The check's in the mail for that.
That's the commercial. Yeah, okay. The first thing to understand is that Putin has expended his conventional military, and the Russians no longer have the ability to conduct offensive operations in Ukraine. That's over, and the Russians have fundamentally gone over to the defensive. The Ukrainians have taken the initiative. They launched the counteroffensive that cleared almost all of Kharkiv Oblast. That was really quite shocking to a lot of people, including especially the Russians. They've been continuing that counteroffensive, pushing toward and somewhat into Luhansk Oblast in the north. And I think the Ukrainians will continue to advance and make gains there. I don't think the Russians can actually stop them if the Ukrainians lean into that offensive. Things have been harder going for the Ukrainians in the south, in the part of Western Kherson Oblast that's on the west bank of the Dnipro River. This is really strategically vital, and one of the things that's important to understand is why different parts of the terrain matter, why different parts of the country matter, and we might want to talk about that a little bit, because you hear sometimes people say, well, why should we be risking nuclear war so Ukraine can recover a few hectares in the east? That's not what's going on. There's actually really strategically vital terrain that Ukraine has to have in order to be able to be secure. And the Russian lodgment on the west bank of the Dnipro is critical. If the Russians retain that lodgment at the end of some kind of agreement, then they would be able to prepare a future invasion of Ukraine that would be very, very hard for the Ukrainians to stop. But if the Ukrainians can push them back across the river and push them closer to Crimea, then the Russians will be in a much less advantageous position for future invasion. So terrain really matters here.
And where are we in that dynamic right now?
So the Ukrainians have been conducting the counteroffensive in Kherson for a while. The Russians, recognizing its importance, have reinforced it with some of their best troops. Their airborne forces have concentrated there. But the Ukrainians broke through a little while ago, made some significant gains. The Russians have reestablished a defensive line for now, but the Russians are clearly preparing to withdraw, have started to withdraw some elements from the northern part of that lodgment on the west bank of the Dnipro River. The Russians are digging in Kherson city proper, but I'm very skeptical that they're actually going to be able to hold if the Ukrainians lean into that offensive. So the Ukrainians are saying they think they can take it back by the end of the year. I think that that's very likely, and it could be sooner than that if the Russian positions start to collapse, which is very possible because the state of the Russian military in the field is appallingly bad. Morale is bad, equipment is bad. The Ukrainians have been pummeling their supplies. They've cut the bridges that lead across the Dnipro a while ago using our American HIMARS systems, and they've just been giving the Russians a really hard time. So it's possible those Russian forces will collapse. It's more likely that they'll pull back, but I do think the Ukrainians will have cleared that lodgment within the next couple of months.
So Kherson, or Kherson, however you say it, is important militarily to focus on. So you read about it and people say, well, it's the largest city, I guess, the Russians have taken. So it's symbolically important, but you're saying it really matters.
No, it does. It does really matter. Just the Dnipro is a big river. And look, my premise here, and we've got to be clear about this.
Yeah.
Putin's objectives have not changed. Putin's objectives are to conquer all of Ukraine. Any ceasefire, which he hasn't offered, or a peace agreement, which he certainly hasn't offered, would be a pause while he regains the strength to threaten a renewed invasion. And so any ceasefire line or any pause line has to be militarily defensible for Ukraine, or else we're just signing Ukraine's death warrant in the next war. And this lodgment is vital, because if the Russians get to start the next offensive with a big mechanized buildup on the west bank of the Dnipro, at a minimum, they will be able to cut off the Ukrainian south, and they probably can unhinge the entire Dnipro River line. So this is really vital.
And so as we go through the next month, 2 months, 3 months, 4 months, Ukraine has enough equipment, or is being given enough equipment by all of us? I mean, how much more do they need, or should they be getting? And where do you think we are? All things equal, leaving aside wildly dramatic changes in the overall geopolitical situation, as it were, where do you think we would be at the end of the year in the actual war?
It's very hard to say because, well, first of all, we at ISW, we don't track Ukraine. We don't collect on Ukraine. We don't try to figure out what Ukrainian military capabilities are. We focus on the enemy. That's our standard policy. So I don't know what the Ukrainians have. We can only observe what effects they're able to generate. They have a lot of stuff that they need. They don't have everything. The Biden administration has done very well giving them equipment that has kept them in the war, giving them support that has kept them in the war, giving them some asymmetric capabilities like HIMARS that have been critical. But it's been a bit dragging. We've tended to be a day late and a weapon system short in our support throughout this war, which has definitely slowed down the Ukrainian counteroffensive. But the Ukrainians have very skillfully used what they have to make these gains. And the key dynamic really is, will the Russian army be able to hang together? And that's something that's just very hard to evaluate before it happens. They collapsed under the Kharkiv counteroffensive in a humiliating fashion. And this is also kind of important because there's still this lingering notion out there. I see that there's some Russian force waiting in the wings that could somehow do something to NATO or somehow, renew the war in Ukraine or something. And there isn't. All of the premier Russian forces have been committed. And the proudest of those was the First Guards Tank Army, which is the force that's normally based around Moscow, which was supposed to be the lead strike force against NATO. And it's been wrecked. And what part of it was wrecked in the Kharkiv counteroffensive, where the Ukrainians captured, I think it was a full regiment's worth of mechanized equipment, some of the very best mechanized equipment from elite First Guards Tank Army units. So it's really hard to say. The Russians could break, and if they do, then things could move a lot faster. If they hold together, then things will move more slowly.
And if they were to break, what is that? Is Crimea in play then, or is that a bridge too far, so to speak?
Look, I mean, it could conceivably be in play if they collapse badly enough. The basic problem with Crimea is just the geography is terrible. So any force attacking in either direction has to go across a narrow isthmus that's relatively easy to defend. So the Russian army would have to collapse pretty thoroughly for the Ukrainians to be able to do that, which is possible, but it's probably the least likely thing to happen at this point.
So it sounds like next 2, 3, 4 months, who knows, but most likely scenarios, I won't say more of the same exactly, but continued Ukrainian successes, some scale of success. And as you say, I think your key point here is, so far for me at least, which is somewhat contrary to the way people talk about it, is Russia does not have a lot of aces in the hole here to play in terms of mobilizing and, forces they haven't committed yet and abilities they haven't used yet and so forth.
No, the Russians have committed all of their reserves. They just did a partial reserve mobilization, which has been a disaster and has put literal cannon fodder in the field. And we've already got, lots of reports of Russian reservists returning in body bags after very short periods of time on the front, having been sent there with no training, no retraining. And this is causing a lot of domestic backlash for Putin. And there's a whole bunch of other weirdness going on about, as the Russians trying to find sort of irregular ways of raising combat forces now, because their conventional approaches have failed. And they're also running low on training capacity. This is the other thing that people have really not focused on. We've been trying to call attention to this for a while, but I say this as a Russian historian, Bill. The notion of the inexhaustible manpower reserves of Russia is so deeply entrenched in the consciousness that people have a hard time thinking through why that works when it does and why it doesn't work here. But one of the things we've observed is that the Russians committed part of their training base to fight early in the war. And when you do that, you really cut down your ability to train reservists or even conscripts. And we're seeing that. The Russians are strapped for trainers. In fact, in the update yesterday, I think we published reports that the Russians are just having soldiers train other soldiers because they've lost I think this is based on Ukrainian reports, the Russians have lost the cadre they need to train people. So, could Putin mobilize 1 million guys, hand them AK-47s and send them into the field? Probably. I'm only going to say probably because it's actually not entirely clear. But what is that? That's 1 million guys waiting to die in mechanized warfare. That's not 1 million useful soldiers. So no, they don't have meaningful reserves.
People like me who don't know much about this yet, we have a slightly cartoonish version of the infinite Russian resources based on our vague knowledge of World War II, basically. And we also have a slightly cartoonish, probably, view of the winter. So say a word about that. I mean, how does the winter cut militarily? And
General Winter, which supposedly saved Russia and the Soviet Union twice, which was false in both cases. So look, winter's tough in Russia and Ukraine, but it's also once the first hard frost hits, Ukraine is perfect tank country in winter. If you want to conduct mechanized operations in Ukraine, winter is perfect because because Ukraine is cut by a whole lot of rivers and streams and stuff. It's very heavily irrigated, which is why it's some of the richest agricultural land in the world. But all of that is kind of a pain in the butt to drive tanks across. So now, on the one hand, both the Ukrainians and the Russians have all the equipment that they need in principle to be able to do that. On the other hand, it's a lot easier to do that when all that stuff just freezes. And so, we should remember that Putin began the invasion in February. And one of the things that was going on was he was trying to take advantage of the hard freeze and make progress before the spring thaw, which is actually the big problem. But the other things, I mean, if you look at World War II, there were massive battles in the winter and lots of advances and retreats. The fighting does not stop in winter. I think, Bill, there's a weird dynamic in our own discourse about this, which is it took Americans a long time to figure out that the Afghan war was seasonal because in the winter, the passes to Pakistan get snowed under.
Right.
And then we got it into our heads rightly that war is seasonal. And I think we're just transposing that in part because also the myth of the Russian winter. So like, I think people are expecting the fighting to slow down in the winter. It won't. The fighting will get tough. And in fact, the Ukrainians probably have a better chance to advance far once there's a hard frost, all that stuff freezes, and then they can drive.
Yeah, that's interesting. So both tough fighting, but also actual movements in the winter. It's not as if everyone has the vague image of everyone gets frozen into their trenches.
No. The time when that happens is called the Rasputitsa, which is basically all the roads go away, which is the spring thaw, because when you've had a hard freeze in a heavily irrigated place, it turns into a sea of mud. Now, even there, of course, they fought through the Rasputitsa this year, both the Russians and the Ukrainians. And again, these are not weird phenomena. The Russians and the Ukrainians are both used to doing this, so their equipment is built for this and stuff.
Yeah, it's not like tanks. It's not like people who haven't thought about that when they were making the tanks, right? I mean, presumably. So, Okay, so what about, so that's very interesting. Russia, Putin, the missiles, the attacks on energy, which do seem to be doing some damage, the attacks on civilians, is it all, well, does it amount to anything, to much militarily? Is it his spite and hatred and genocidal, character, so to speak? Is there a theory behind this?
Yeah, I think there are a number of theories behind it. He needed to do something. I mean, this is in part, possibly in large part, a response to domestic pressure from there's been a weird dynamic that Putin has had that the ISW team is reporting on for a long time of engaging with the hardline extremist pro-war faction that is represented by a group of people we call the mill bloggers. These are guys with Telegram channels mostly, with usually with 250,000 to 500,000 followers, so very significant influencers. And
pretty knowledgeable in some cases.
They actually put out some pretty good analysis, and they have been very critical of the Russian war effort. And it's a weird kind of glasnost because they are the only platforms that Putin has allowed to criticize the war effort continuously. And the Russian Ministry of Defense has been trying to shut them down for a long time, and Putin hasn't let them be shut down. They kind of lost their minds after the Kharkiv counteroffensive, and then Putin ordered mobilization, and then that quickly turned into a disaster. And then they started losing their minds about that, and then we had annexation, but then we immediately had setbacks in Kherson. So the dynamic has been a steady increase in pressure on Putin from the pro-war hawks that he seems to think he needs to do something. And the something that he could do when he got his hands on Iranian drones was increase attacks on Ukrainian civilian infrastructure, which the hawks had been demanding. I think, so part of this, I think, is actually buying off the pro-war extremist constituency that he seems to care about. I think the theory is, on the one hand, it's the same theory that strategic bombing always has, that he'll somehow break the will of the Ukrainian people. But he's also, look, the one card that Putin thinks he has to play is energy.
Yeah. So talk about that a little bit. I mean, how much damage can he do, and how much does it spill over to Europe and so forth? And
well, it does spill over to Europe some. It interferes with Ukraine's ability to export energy, and it can require, in fact, Ukraine to start drawing energy from Europe in some ways. I don't know, depending on how they do that. But it's all part of an energy play. Because I think one of the things that Putin is counting on is that if he can keep the war going into the winter, he can literally freeze Europe into surrender. And I do think that this has become one of his leading theories of the case, that Russia has never imposed the full extent of an energy blockade on Europe. And I think Putin thinks that the Europeans can't sustain it. so that if he can just keep the war going long enough to freeze them, they will surrender. And I think what he's doing to Ukraine is, on the one hand, a demonstration effect. On the other hand, depriving, making sure that Ukraine can't export any energy at all, and possibly trying to create a requirement for it to import energy at the same time that he is going to freeze Europe. I think that's the main part of the play here.
How much suffering can he just impose on Ukraine and make life pretty miserable for them and difficult, and therefore, I suppose, affect somewhat the military performance. They need energy to fight the war too, right? Not just to, live decently at home and in the cities, but also, what about you? Then we should talk about Europe a minute and how you've been following that too. How real do you think are you more or less worried than you were a few months ago about European energy in the winter and its effect on Europe's support for Ukraine?
Well, I mean, Putin is inflicting a lot of suffering on Ukrainians, and of course, if he can sustain this into the winter, Ukraine is not a good place to be when it's cold and you don't have electricity. This campaign is not going to succeed any better than previous strategic bombing campaigns have succeeded. What Putin doesn't understand, or I don't think he understands, is that, having embarked on what is effectively a genocidal war, you don't break the will of the people that you are threatening with genocide.
Right.
That's not a thing. This is why the Soviets rallied around Stalin in 1941, because Hitler came in with a genocidal program that everybody understood. Putin's kind of doing that in Ukraine. So he can inflict a lot of suffering on the Ukrainian people, courtesy of his good friends in the Islamic Revolutionary Guards Corps. But he's not going to break their will. And what he's doing is not actually having very significant military effects, because militaries can function off of an electrical grid. They're designed to do that. So the stuff he's hitting right now I don't think is going to degrade the Ukrainian military very seriously. In terms of Europe, I mean, look, who knows, right? It's obviously, there's a lot of unhappiness in Europe about energy prices. European governments don't like this, and leading governments in Europe, the French, can never quite cure themselves with the notion that they need to be somewhere in between the NATO alliance of which they are part and its enemies. And the Germans are really having just about a nervous breakdown at the pressures that are being put on them to actually kind of engage in a war, which they decided decades ago, in a way that makes me not unhappy that they didn't want to do.
Right.
So the pressures are there, and of course, as we get into the winter, the pressures will grow. But I think there are a couple of dynamics that make me a little bit more sanguine about this than I would otherwise be. First of all, when people are unhappy about energy prices, when people are unhappy about being cold and that kind of stuff, in democracies, they look at the government and they say, "What are you doing about it?" They don't, in my judgment, usually get super specific about, you need to surrender to Ukraine, or you need to surrender Ukraine to Russia because we want our energy prices to be. That's not, the demand is, why aren't you providing me energy? And so I think we can have a lot of anger and unhappiness in Europe about energy without that turning into demands from European peoples to surrender to the Russians. And in fact, polling seems to bear that out, that people are unhappy about energy, but they're not saying that their government should stop supporting Ukraine based on that. So that's the first thing. And the second thing is, this is a kind of a genocidal war. And Putin keeps plumbing new depths of evil. And you do have to think about it. If you're going to be Scholz or Macron, or whoever happens to be in number 10 at the moment, how is it going to play over the longer term for you in your next election if you have surrendered Ukraine to Satan? Because that's kind of the dynamic that Putin keeps creating here. And in that sense, Putin is helping us keep the Europeans very strong, because he looks so unreasonable. He looks so evil. He's doing such horrific things that he's making it very hard for any democratic leader to surrender to him.
Yeah, I talked to someone in Prague earlier this week, or last week, I guess, late last week, and I said, "Well, how bad is it? Just energy prices, and how does it look?" He said, "Look, their prices for their apartment are up 2 to 3 times." I said, "Is it having a huge political effect?" He said, "Well, look, for example, we haven't turned there's in the 50s in Prague, I think last week. So we haven't turned our energy, our heat on yet. We're wearing sweaters and in the, when we're home, and more blankets on the bed and so forth. But it's tolerable for now. When it gets colder, it gets tougher." But he said very much what you just said, that it's the alternative is so appalling that at least in Czech Republic, at least in Poland, maybe this doesn't hold for every country, of course, France, Germany might be different. There's not much sentiment that this means we need to let Putin, abduct another million Ukrainian children or a million Ukrainian children and kill, civilians and torture them and so forth. So
Germans are keeping on nuclear power plants beyond when they were going to do that. I mean,
it also sounds like practically the energy situation isn't quite as bad as people thought it might be 6 months from now in terms of price and the Europeans, and maybe we behind, have done a little more than I guess we expected to kind of get some things set up to.
Yeah, I mean, I think Putin has made it clear for long enough, and this is part of the problem that he has. He's telegraphed all of these punches in a certain way so that people have been able to get as ready for this as one can, and find alternatives. And I know we'll talk about this more, later in the conversation, but this is therefore, I think, likely to be a net devastating thing for Russia, because he's actually going to drive Europe to find the alternatives to Russian energy that it should have been doing for decades.
Yeah, Europe will liberate itself from Russian energy.
He's causing that.
Well, before we get to that, I guess, and the longer term effects, what about the sort of the threats, the dam, the threats, the pretense that Ukraine's going to use dirty bombs, the threat, apparently, the thoughts about destroying that dam and flooding areas, the nuclear weapons is the high end, I suppose, of these. What is all that about? I mean, is it going to do any of that? Is it something that will rattle people? It won't rattle people? Is it desperation? Is it real?
Well, we had a slightly more reassuring report from the Ukrainian head of military intelligence yesterday that the Russians have not rigged the dam on the Dnipro to destroy the dam fully. They've rigged it to do damage to part of it. But Budanov, the GUR head, said they haven't brought the kinds of explosives that would be required to blow up the whole dam and unleash the full fury of that reservoir on southern Kherson. And I believe him, Ukrainians would be able to see it if they had done that. So that prospect looks a little more remote than we had thought, based on comments from other Ukrainian officials. So I expect the Russians to blow up part of the dam, including, especially, the issue I think the Russians have is there's a road that runs across that dam. And they need the Ukrainians not to be able to use that road if they lose the dam, if the Russians lose the dam. So I expect they'll do enough damage to the top of the dam to make sure the Ukrainians can't readily repair the road that goes across it. But it doesn't, I guess, sound right now like the Russians are actually preparing to blow the whole dam, which is good. On the nuclear weapons front,
and the nuclear power plant and some of these, and the dirty bombs, which is a kind of not quite a nuclear weapon at all.
Well, it isn't a nuclear weapon at all.
It's the use of radiation as part of a conventional weapon, right? I guess.
Yeah, no, we need to be clear about this because people have gotten confused about this. A dirty bomb is a conventional explosive laced with radioactive material, and it just sprays radioactive material around in a relatively small area. The Russian game seems to be, and they've refined it because we obviously collectively not getting the message they were trying to communicate the first time. Their game seems to be to say that the Ukrainians are going to use a dirty bomb and then accuse the Russians of having used tactical nuclear weapon because there will be radioactive, radiological effects, and then like that. Every part of this is nonsensical. The Ukrainians are not going to use a dirty bomb in their own country. No one's interested in accusing the Russians of using nuclear weapons if they don't use them. So it's all kind of nonsensical. And then you ask me, well, are the Russians preparing to use a nuclear weapon? And the answer is yes and no. the Russians have been setting informational conditions to use non-strategic nuclear weapons for almost the entire war. And they haven't used them, even though multiple ostensible red lines have been crossed that Putin could have used under Russian nuclear doctrine to justify using non-strategic nuclear weapons. Look, here's the deal. The Russians could conceivably use what people call tactical nuclear weapons, low-yield nuclear weapons, in a battlefield role for the purpose of disrupting Ukrainian offensives. And the weapons are small enough that they could hit targets away from their own front lines, pray that the prevailing winds don't shift and blow the radiation back toward their guys, and disrupt Ukrainian offensives with multiple. It would not, one is not enough. They would have to use quite a few tactical nuclear weapons, I think, to generate a meaningful effect on the battlefield. There are a few problems with doing that from the Russian perspective. One is wins are wins, and you can have this stuff blow back on your own people. And the one thing that I'm 100% confident of is that even though the Russian military is theoretically designed and equipped to be able to function on a nuclear battlefield, the untrained cats and dogs they've got running around now absolutely cannot. So they will be irradiating their own soldiers, and they'll be having bad stuff happen to their own people, which will be a problem for them. A bigger problem for them, actually, for Putin, actually, could be the fact that given that any area they irradiate, they can't advance into. So the use of tactical nuclear weapons in that way creates a wall beyond which the Russians can't advance, which is a problem because Putin has annexed territory that he doesn't control. So using those weapons is a statement that he's not going to. Now, he could get around that in all kinds of ways, but there are some problems here, both militarily and conceptually, with doing that. So then
you think he would do it just as a prelude to, okay, this thing is spiraling out of control, we need to have negotiations tomorrow? And
he could conceivably, and I think, you could imagine scenarios in which the Russian army is collapsing so bad that he decides that he's got to just, freeze the advance long enough to be able to do that and pay whatever price. That's, I think, the likeliest scenario in which we could see something like that happening. But there's a whole bunch of calculations he would have to make, including he would have to be convinced that using a number of tactical nuclear weapons would draw no meaningful NATO response, either military or in any other way, and that doing so would actually cause the desired outcome. Because this is the other thing. Russia right now has become a third-rate military power in every aspect except its nuclear arsenal. The one reason coming out of this war why anybody is going to have to regard Russia as something other than a second-rate regional state is the nuclear arsenal. If Putin uses nuclear weapons and does not achieve the decisive effect that he seeks, he will have devalued the one last thing that actually gives him the big seat at the global table. That's a very high stake for him. And I think it's important not to underestimate this. Now, look, but at the end of the day, Bill, this is all reasoning. And there's no way to know what kind of calculation he will make.
Have we done a decent job, do you think, of signaling to him that this is a line that he takes himself, we will respond in various ways that will be pretty devastating, although albeit apparently we'll use conventional weapons, but we could do a ton of damage, obviously, if we use actual NATO forces as opposed to giving stuff to Ukrainians. Do you think we've done a decent job of signaling to him that this could be the end for him in that respect? I mean,
I've been a bit of a contrarian about this because Biden's Armageddon remarks, caught a lot of heat. And I do think that people who are criticizing him, and I understand and sympathize with all of the criticism, I do, actually, because it was not the right venue for doing that, and there are various problems with what he said. But there is a logic inherent in what he said that we have actually reinforced with action. That is exactly the logic that Putin needed to hear, because Biden said, look, if we start having, tactical nuclear weapons, then, we can end up with Armageddon. Okay, well, how does that work? The only way that that can happen is because the Russians use tactical nuclear weapons and we respond militarily. The Russians up the ante. We up the ante. The Russians go to a nuclear strike, and we respond with a nuclear strike. That's the only way you get Armageddon. So implicit in that statement is we will do all of those things. And although I think a lot of Biden's critics didn't hear that, I think Putin did, because it's inexorable. Otherwise, it's not Armageddon if Putin uses tactical nuclear weapons and we don't do anything. So the logic of that statement was important, but then we've done a few other things. So NATO just did a big nuclear exercise that was reportedly long pre-planned and stuff, which is fine. But, NATO's been known to cancel pre-planned exercises we didn't. And beyond that, I saw, interestingly, we surfaced an Ohio-class ballistic missile submarine in the Middle East, and the CENTCOM commander got on board and did a little inspection. That was an interesting piece of messaging. First of all, we never surface those things, and we never report where they are. Second of all, I doubt that they spend a lot of time in the Middle East. And the prominence of that was to say to Russia and China, I think, the way that it was sort of reported out was that that's sort of equidistant. It was clearly a strategic nuclear flex. And it's important.
Those are nuclear armed missiles.
Yeah, no, those are submarine launched nuclear ballistic missiles that of the sort that we would use in an Armageddon scenario, and not for any other purpose. So it was a nuclear flex, and it was clearly intended to be. So it's hard. You never know what might be being messaged by other channels, but the public communications and messaging have been making it clear to Putin that the Biden administration is seriously thinking about what it would do, and is seriously looking at military options and seriously thinking about its nuclear arsenal. And those are the right messages to be sending to Putin in this circumstance.
And I guess just to wrap this part of it, that would hold also for, trying to create a mini Chernobyl with that Ukrainian nuclear plant and all that sort of thing. I mean, just the general menu of really brutal and horrifying things that Putin could do. It sounds like you think we've done a decent job of telling him not to do them, and he seems so far to have heard that message.
Yeah, I'll come back to the messages he hears in a second. On the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, look, it's actually, I'm not a nuclear power plant expert, but I understand it's actually very difficult to generate any kind of Chernobyl effect with that power plant, because it's not a Chernobyl type power plant. It's a much safer modern design. It's actually not easy to cause that kind of problem. I think the biggest risk actually is with the spent fuel rods that are there and various other things that could cause contamination. But I think the Russians would have a hard time, even if they wanted to, generating a Chernobyl kind of accident.
Good.
Which doesn't mean that they can't do bad things, and it doesn't mean that they can't cause radiological incidents. And I don't know that they couldn't, penetrate a reactor vessel and do a bunch of stuff. There are some problems with trying to do that from their perspective, including you're doing that on a river that flows into the Black Sea and then flows out past Crimea. So any radioactivity that you put in the water goes past territory that you're claiming is Russian, where you've got a big naval base. And it's going to blow back onto territory that you're also claiming is Russian in Ukraine, and you're going to irradiate your own people. And look, Putin is enough of an evil guy that he could decide that he doesn't care. And you have to, let me be very clear about something. Anybody who starts his engagement with a nuclear power plant off by having tanks go up and fire main gun rounds at reactor containment vessels, which is what the Russians did, is crazy enough to do anything stupid in that sense. But there are a lot of good reasons for him not to go very far along this path, and very few reasons actually to do it. So again, he's been such an orc that it's hard to tell, but on balance, I'm much more worried about that than I am about him using tactical nuclear weapons, but I'm still not panicking about that one.
Okay. Well, let's talk about Putin then in general. Sort of what less, as you said, you're going to come back to what he's hearing and is he hearing us, too many of us here in Western Europe talking about giving him off ramps? Are there such things? And let's get into that discussion.
Yeah, yes. I mean, I think the bad side of the Western discourse is that we can't get two ideas out of our heads. One is that, quote, this will end and things will go back to normal. And I know you want to finish with that, so I'll hold that. But the other is that Putin must recognize that he's in a bad spot and he must want some face-saving way out. Because we think that that's how we would be in a similar situation. Now, it's actually not clear to me that that's how we would be in a similar situation, because that's actually not all that normal. Once people have committed this kind of blood, treasure, and honor into a fight, face-saving ways out are not usually what they're looking for.
Ways out of, just to think of the U.S., ways out of a Vietnam or Afghanistan, countries at the other side of the world, which we can discuss, whether those were face-saving or honorable, but that's pretty different from right on your border where you said this is, these people don't deserve to exist and this needs to be part of your country, right? That's
and you've identified it as an existential thing and it's your legacy, and it's all the rhetoric that he's using is such that it's hard to see what a face-saving way out of this would be for him. But the key thing is Putin doesn't think like this. This is a guy whose mantra is weakness is lethal. And he has been given endless opportunities to offer a ceasefire. And in fact, this has been the most dangerous course of action that he could pursue from my perspective for a long time, is simply to offer an actual no-kidding ceasefire, which I think a lot of Western leaders would leap on enthusiastically.
Most dangerous in the sense of undercutting our own determination.
Yeah. And leave him in a very advantageous position to build up his strength and launch new attacks in the future, which is exactly what he's done with every previous ceasefire he has ever made in Ukraine or Syria. That is exactly what he has done. And he hasn't taken any of those opportunities. And we need to read something into that. We need to read into that his determination to carry this war to what, from his perspective, successful conclusion. And he must have some conviction that he can't afford to do that, either internationally or domestically or whatever. He's not looking for off-ramps. And in fact, what we're seeing is he is absorbing a lot of domestic pain, more than he ever has before, to set conditions for a long, grinding conventional war. That is not what you do if you're looking for an off-ramp. This is just, if you look at the behavior and look at what he's doing with the mobilization, with the now declarations of states of emergency and partial martial law in big parts of Russia, with all kinds of activity that he's engaged in that are making his people very unhappy, that have generated unprecedented protests in Russia, are now generating ethnic and religious fratricide incidents in the Russian military. All of that. Why is he doing that? Because he's trying to find every body that he can find to throw into the fight to continue the war and set conditions to be able to do that for the long term. That's not the behavior of somebody who's looking for an off-ramp. So here's the thing. He's not going to be interested in any off-ramp until he is confident that he can't win. And if you're interested in making him make for an off-ramp, you first have to defeat him. When you have defeated him, then you can have a conversation about what face-saving you can do to help him accept the defeat. But people are too quick to say, let's negotiate before he's too embarrassed or whatever. That's not, first of all, it's not the way people work generally, but it's really not the way a guy like Putin works.
Yeah, that's interesting. Who knows, even if he is embarrassed, whether he wants, at that point, he accepts a quote off-ramp, or whether the off-ramp still has to have an on-ramp after it that we don't want to, that we shouldn't, the Ukrainians certainly shouldn't want to give him, and so forth. But But it sounds like you think, I mean, all again, who knows, but 3, 4, 5 months from now, where the war is continuing, it doesn't seem like you see much, very high probability of a rapid end, and probably continuing somewhat as it is now, with Ukraine having made some advances, perhaps.
Yeah, I mean, I think that so the most likely course of events here is the Ukrainians continue their counteroffensives, continue to make gains. The Russians continue to be unable to stop them, and the Ukrainians sort of push slowly forward in the northeast and the south, possibly doing something else elsewhere. And it continues in that way. That's the most likely course of action.
That's sort of short-termish. I mean,
over the next few months, yeah. Into the winter. If you start thinking about deviations from that, one possibility is the Russian military collapses in one front or another, and the Ukrainians make more rapid gain, which is very possible. Then you get into, worst case scenarios for us and for Ukraine. One being, Western support collapses, which I think is very unlikely, but is possible. Or Russian nuclear use, which again I also think is unlikely but is possible. And those are pretty much, short of something just real wacky happening, those are pretty much the only ways in which things change very dramatically for the worse, I think. And again, I think they're very unlikely, but possible.
But the fact that things may not change dramatically over the next 2, 3, 4 months doesn't mean A, it's not a dramatic moment, and B, that this is sustainable for 6 or 12 or 24 or 36 months, right? I mean, this is unlikely to become a frozen war of indeterminate outcome, or
it is unlikely to become a frozen war. I mean, I think at this point, it only becomes a frozen war if the West freezes support for Ukraine and deprives the Ukrainians of the ability to continue their counteroffensive. Because at this point, I think it's very unlikely the Russians of their own capabilities are going to be able to stop the Ukrainian counteroffensives. So the West would have to do that. And if the West did that, the West could cause this to become a temporarily frozen conflict on terms that would be pretty favorable to the Russians, because we need to understand this. For all of the progress that the Ukrainians have made, the territory that the Russians continue to hold and will continue to hold, even if the Ukrainians clear the west bank of the Dnipro, puts them in an enormously more advantageous position than they were when they started this invasion. Seriously compromises Ukraine's ability to defend itself. Seriously wrecks the Ukrainian economy. I mean, we need to understand the territory the Russians have occupied in the east, the Donbass region, was Ukraine's industrial heartland. That's where most of Ukrainian mineral extraction processing occurred. It's a huge component of the Ukrainian economy. Taking all of that away does fearful damage to the Ukrainian economy. The agricultural lands, you can pretty much go one, hectare for dollars, the cost of taking agricultural land away from Ukraine. The Russians have taken a lot of it. This is something the West needs to think about, because the more damage we allow to the Ukrainian economy, the more Ukraine becomes a ward of the international community, the more we will have to end up paying to sustain and support a rump Ukraine that will be much more vulnerable to future Russian attack. So it is not in our interest to freeze this conflict, which is one of the reasons why I think we probably won't. But that discussion is not receiving remotely enough attention, in my view.
Yeah, that's interesting. Well, so President Biden just calls you in and says, I want to have 2 conversations with you, Fred. One, a short, medium term, what should we be doing better or more of differently in the kind of 3-6 month window, I suppose, maybe. And then a bigger conversation about has the world changed, or what lessons do I need to begin learning and have the U.S. government, the U.S. and the nation learn about the implications of this moment.
Yeah, I would say, Mr. President, you've done a decent job so far in keeping the Ukrainians in this fight and giving them what they need to be liberating their territory slowly. And you've done a pretty good job, I think, of deterring, strengthening nuclear deterrence. deterrence of nuclear use by the Russians. And I think you need to count on the latter. I think you need to count on deterrence continuing to work. And I think you need to accelerate the aid that you give to the Ukrainians, because protracting this conflict is not in anybody's interest. It's actually not better to have the Ukrainians win slowly. It's actually better to end this thing. And we end this thing by giving the Ukrainians the weapons they need to continue liberating the strategically vital parts of their country that they must have in order to be secure or stable. Even setting aside the very important issue that, of course, they have a right to liberate all of their territory as a sovereign state. So we should be giving them more. We should be giving it faster. We need to mobilize our defense industrial base. We're hearing a lot about strains that we have providing the Ukrainians with this equipment. That is a solvable problem if we will invest in it, and we need to do that. And that brings me to my next point, Mr. President, which is you need to understand that things are not going to go back to normal. We have gone through a fundamental change in the international arena, and we are in a new epoch. Russia has made itself the enemy of the West and the enemy of free peoples in an absolutely explicit, unequivocal way. It's made itself a pariah in a way that you cannot forgive this regime. You cannot just go back to treating it as a normal regime. Once a regime has embarked on a genocidal war, you can't then pretend, that doesn't go away. And the Russians have changed the situation in profound ways. They have made enemies of countries that were not their enemies, starting with Ukraine. And that's not going to change. So we have to have a strategy for dealing with the new Cold War, actually trying to get it back to a Cold War to begin with, on good terms for us, not making the mistake that we made at the beginning of the actual Cold War of ceding too much territory to the Soviets and putting ourselves in a very difficult position, but make sure instead that this one starts on terms that are advantageous to us, and then girding ourselves for it, because we are going to be, when the fighting stops in Ukraine, in a new Cold War with Russia unequivocally.
That assumes no regime change in Russia, I suppose, which you think unlikely?
It assumes that Putinism continues in Russia. So, Putin will die at some point, and I will celebrate. But if he is replaced by any of the people currently in the regime, the ideology will continue. So you would have to have a real revolution in Russia, which is, a consummation devoutly to be wished, but the odds of that are always low. So you have to assume that this regime, this ideology will continue for some time, while hoping that it doesn't.
How much of this is you made very clearly, I think, the case, this is a big inflection point for U.S., Russia and the rest of the world, or Russia and the liberal democracies. How much is it an inflection point more broadly for Russia, Iran, China, and the rest of us?
It is very much an inflection for all of them. Now, of course, the Iranians are going through an inflection of their own.
Right.
This has inverted the relationship between Russia and Iran in a fascinating way. Since the birth of the Islamic Republic, Iran has been either hostile to Russia, or then as it moved close, it has been the tail to the Russian dog. Now the Russians need the Iranians a lot more than the Iranians need the Russians. This is the first time that's been true. And the Iranians are going to be interested in taking that out for a spin. But they are in their own crisis, which frankly, we're more likely to see the end of the Islamic Republic soon than we are to see the end of Putinism, in my judgment.
Interesting.
So it's hard to tell.
And a kind of good end in the sense of course, it'll be messy, but not just another horrible regime replacing it.
Well, I mean, who knows?
Yeah.
And that's worrisome. And it's something that we actually have to think more seriously about. But that's a topic for another day. All of this, would have the effect of leaving China as the standard bearer for autocracy in the world. And of course, unfortunately, Xi is making it clear that he's got delusions of Stalin and possibly Mao, and that's very worrisome. The lessons that Xi takes from Ukraine are going to depend very much on the outcome. If Putin ends up with anything like the territory that he now has, I think Xi is likely to look at that and say, perseverance is fine. Perseverance works. You can suffer setbacks, but make big gains, and maybe nothing really terrible happens to you that you can't deal with. And main lesson is don't be incompetent. If Putin loses here, if the West really continues to push back and help the Ukrainians push him all the way back and just make him lose, possibly Xi looks at that and says, the Western alliance actually held together a lot better than I would have thought. And maybe I need to think about how confident I am that people aren't going to rally around Taiwan. Hard to say, but I think the outcome is really going to matter here. And I think, kind of like an election, none of the campaigning matters when the votes are counted. And I think that's what Xi is going to be looking at there. But listen, Bill, I mean, we've now spent close to 9 months with a massive conventional war in Europe for the first time since 1945, with the topic of nuclear war and nuclear weapons regularly in the discussion, with the NATO alliance mobilizing, with the Russians threatening everybody under the sun. We're in a new place. Things are getting normalized that have been just off the table.
Yeah, that's so interesting. And I would just say, just looking at it from even further back in a sense, I mean, if you had said a year ago to any of us, this 9 months of a major war with, you say, nuclear threats and so forth, right there in Europe, and Western Europe, NATO changed, and European nations behaving in ways they haven't for decades, especially Germany. And Xi, we're speaking on October 25th. I should have mentioned this earlier. So Xi just this past week has further consolidated power. And so we have a somewhat different situation in China. I think it's fair to say that maybe we had, or a more exaggeration of a situation we had already. And Iranian demonstrations that seem to be maybe qualitatively different from in the past, all happening at once. And this is all like 2022, I feel like it's really kind of a somewhat extraordinary moment. I mean, I guess one forgets the Cold War. You mentioned giving, the European front of it, so to speak, in 47, 48, 49. But of course, the other thing that happened in 49 is Mao Zedong, took over China. So it's sort of, things do tend to happen. I don't know if they tend to happen. They can happen in different parts of the world at a certain kind of either synchronization, or in any case, the sort of inflection points are not just limited to one theater, so to speak. It does feel like it's a big moment. I mean, in the post 1989 or 1991 world.
I really, it feels that way to me. And I think the only thing about this that really alarms me is that it's just not really penetrating our domestic consciousness.
So let's talk about that. I mean, it's both the U.S. government and then the U.S. nation. How far off are we from understanding the moment and grasping the moment, and how far off are we from beginning to do what we should be doing?
Well, I think we're far away and not getting closer. I mean, the Biden national security strategy is written as if it has nothing to do with the current situation, and that nothing has changed. Biden administration defense budgets show no recognition of the reality that we need to rebuild our military. All kinds of alarm bells should be going off that we're having such a hard time supporting Ukraine in the limited ways in which we're supporting it. That says all kinds of bad things about our defense industrial base and how well or poorly postured we are. Which is alarming, because we're talking loudly about the risk of an imminent war with China. And frankly, I think we may be exaggerating the imminency of that risk, but okay, that's where the debate is. It's where the administration is, what we're talking about. Okay, well, are we building up our military to be prepared for that war? No.
And if I could add, do we have an energy policy that takes account in a serious way of the changes, both with respect to Russia, but also conceivably with respect to Iran, and for that matter, whatever China would do, which would have its own effects, right?
No, I mean, we're still acting like we're a huge island that is fundamentally not threatened by anything in the world. and that, other than climate change, and that it's all optional. I mean, the bottom line is we're still acting like this is all optional. And the truth is, it really isn't. I understand that the Russians are not mobilizing on our borders, but it's a vital American national security interest not to have the Russians rolling over Ukraine, not to have the Russians weakening or destroying NATO, not to have the Russians establishing the principle that this is a Hobbesian world and that the Melian dialogue is in effect and the strong do what they will and the weak do what they must. These are actually vital American national interests, that Xi is looking, that it'll matter to Americans a huge amount whether Taiwan remains independent or not. And that, by the way, there's a low-grade war already going on in the Middle East. It doesn't have to stay low-grade. We have a lot of very, very dangerous things going on, and we have a lot of Americans running around in the Middle East. And not just the ones who are running around fighting ISIS. And by the way, ISIS is still out there. We're also acting as if terrorism has gone away. It hasn't. The Salafi jihadi movement is actually, in many respects, stronger than it has ever been. It happens not to have tried to attack us recently, which is partly by design. And so we've decided that it's over. It isn't. All kinds of terrible things are happening in Africa that we actually may well end up being concerned about in many, many different ways. So the world has become a very, very dangerous place with a lot of very, very evil people having amassed a lot of power. And Bill, the problem is, I think the core problem is Americans have largely come to the conclusion that we're actually pretty evil too. And we are really having an almost impossible time understanding that for all of our flaws and all of our internal problems and all of our challenges, which are very real, we are the most powerful force for good in the world. And we actually need to gird our loins and be prepared to fight for the good in the world, even as we deal with our own problems. It's this internal divide that I think is the biggest single danger that we're facing right now.
Yeah, and from the right thinks we're terrible because we're a woke nation, and the left thinks we're terrible because for reasons it's so often that we're terrible, and it's got to weaken us. Yeah, I mean, the one thing I guess I'd just close to this is that people like me, and I think you have talked about the international liberal order and the accomplishments of it since 1945, and totally underrated, and what would the world look like if it didn't exist, and so forth. I almost feel like the rhetoric of maintaining that order, defending it, is almost too, I don't know, backward looking at this point, though. We're just, as you sort of said very well, it's such a new moment. We have to create or recreate or create maybe such a new order. It's not a matter of simply propping up we do have to do some propping up, and we should build on what exists, of course. But in terms of NATO and US, Japan defense, and all the things that do exist. But people still think, if I could put it on our side, on the responsible side of the U.S. debate, there's still I feel like a little bit too much of a lack of a sense that this is really not just another time where we've got to just buckle down and kind of prop that stuff back up, but really think anew and build anew, I think.
No, I agree with you. I think this is an architectonic moment for us, and we're going to have to create a new order. Now, we have a lot of legacy elements from the old order to help us. The NATO alliance is critical. Our alliances in Asia are critical. There are various international mechanisms in place that are critical to defend or are important. So it won't be completely new, but at a minimum, we need a counteroffensive if we don't need something entirely new. But we can't just defend it anymore. We've lost ground, and we're going to have to retake it.
Interesting. Well, that's good. It's good, challenging, a little bit daunting, but important note to end on. So, anything we should have covered that we didn't, Fred? I think you've done a terrific job explaining the situation. We'll have to reconvene soon to get back on this situation, but also Iran and other things. And but Fred, thank you for joining me today, and I really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me, Bill.
And thank all of you for joining us on Conversations.